Welcome, hello. This video offers a brief introduction to the First Amendment. While the First Amendment has always loomed large in American history and political discussion, the past few years have presented new questions and conversations about the First Amendment and what it's meant to protect. Today we'll be focusing mostly on the First Amendment rights of freedom of speech and the right to assemble, and how those protections apply to protesters and demonstrators. A few things to start before we begin. This video is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. I'm a law student, I'm not an attorney. If you have legal questions, please seek the advice of a licensed attorney. I'd also like to acknowledge the sources consulted in preparation for this video. Many thanks to the ACLU's website and sections on protesters' rights. It was immensely helpful in the process of researching for this video, and I've linked the page down below in the description box. As a person participating in a demonstration or protest, you have rights entitled to you by the Constitution. This presentation will introduce the First Amendment, freedom of speech, the rights of protesters, and how the Constitution protects, or should protect, people from government overreach and police interference. Please keep in mind that while you are entitled to these constitutional protections and protection from police interference, this unfortunately does not assure that your rights won't be violated and does not assure that you won't have a negative encounter with law enforcement. The purpose of this video is to distinguish what is and isn't constitutionally protected, what you're entitled to, and what to do when your rights are violated. With that being said, let's get into it. What's the First Amendment? First Amendment is one of the rights found in the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution. The text of the amendment reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." Let's break that down clause by clause. The text of the amendment mentions religion, free speech, the press, assembly, and redressing of grievances. There's two clauses of the amendment that relate to religion. There's the Establishment Clause, which forbids the government from establishing a religion. So essentially, the Establishment Clause enshrines the separation of church and state. There can be no national religion. Government and religion don't mix. Then there's the Free Exercise Clause, which protects religious freedom and religious expression. The government can't create a state religion, and it can't interfere with religious freedoms of individuals. Next, we have freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. Those two parts of the First Amendment may be more familiar. After that, it says there's a right to peaceably assemble. That means you have a constitutional right to protest and demonstrate, so long as it's peaceful. Keep that in mind, right to peaceably assemble. And then there's the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's a more complicated way of saying there's a right to formally file a complaint against the government. This is often done through the courts, but could also include actual petitions. Before I move on, let's step back 1 second and reflect on the first 5 words of the amendment. This is really important. The first 5 words of the amendment are "Congress shall make no law." The First Amendment is meant to restrict the ability of the government to restrict the freedoms of the people. Keep that in mind, and we'll circle back to that in a little bit. Now that we've broken down the amendment into each part, let's talk more about the freedom of speech. So the freedom of speech means that there is a right to express yourself verbally through the spoken word, but it doesn't just include spoken words. Protected speech is a much more expansive category and is not limited to spoken word. Conduct is included in that category when the conduct is meant to send a message or express a certain belief. The Supreme Court case Texas v. Johnson answered the question of whether or not it was constitutional to burn an American flag. Mr. Johnson, pictured in that photo with the flag, was charged and criminally prosecuted because he burned an American flag. There was a Texas statute that made that a crime. The Supreme Court held that that statute was unconstitutional. Burning a flag was a form of expression. Mr. Johnson was expressing beliefs critical of the United States government. It was unconstitutional to charge him with a crime for doing so. And it's a pretty extreme example, but it's a fitting one. It protects expression in various forms. The First Amendment protects controversial acts and messages, so long as no one's being harmed, even if the message is controversial, even if the message is something many of us would find repugnant. It's protected. It speaks to how far-reaching the protections of the First Amendment are. Individuals have a right to voice opinions critical of the government. They have a right to voice opinions we disagree with, so long as they're not imminent threats to lawless action, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It's a fine line, but at bottom, beliefs are protected. You're allowed to be wrong. You're allowed to state it. You can't act on something hateful, but in and of itself, a belief that we believe to be inflammatory, highly subjective, offensive, an act that many would consider to be offensive, it's protected. It's a form of protected speech. In an interview, the late Justice Antonin Scalia, who was known as one of the court's far more conservative members, summed up his views on the First Amendment issues in Texas v. Johnson with this quote, "If I were king, I would not allow people to go around burning the American flag. However, we have a First Amendment which says that the right of free speech shall not be abridged, and it is addressed in particular to speech critical of the government. That was the main kind of speech that tyrants would seek to suppress." Now that we've talked about the amendment and what's protected and the freedom of speech, let's shift to the right to assemble. Within the past few years, more and more people have been exercising their right to assemble. Many important issues of social justice and racial inequality have come to the forefront within the past few years, and you're seeing more people take to the streets and demonstrate. Your right to protest and demonstrate is protected by the First Amendment. You must be allowed to demonstrate so long as it's peaceful. Most protests typically take place in public areas. In fact, your constitutionally protected right to assemble applies only to public property. We'll talk about assembly and private property in a minute. Different rules do apply for organizing a protest, so sometimes you have to obtain a permit. Something like the Women's March is a pretty large event. It's large scale, it involves marching in the streets. Organizers for those events have to work out logistics with municipalities, and they have to obtain permits. For the purposes of this video, we're only talking about individuals protesting. We're not talking about organization of demonstrations. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, the ACLU website does have very good information. We won't be covering that today. In terms of location, you're allowed to protest on streets, sidewalks, in public parks, and outside of government buildings. When you're demonstrating outside a government building, you just have to make sure you're not obstructing entrance and egress from the building. So if people are trying to get in or out, you have to allow them to do that. Otherwise, perfectly acceptable and constitutionally protected to protest outside of a government building. You also need to be mindful of traffic. So if you're on a sidewalk or in the street, you may be asked by the police to move to keep the flow of traffic going and maintain safety. That's allowable. They can do that. It's in order to maintain public safety. So that's one of the few things that they can tell you what to do. Otherwise, sidewalks, streets, parks, constitutionally protected place to protest. So we've covered a few basic areas about protected speech and expression. We've gone over what speech means, what your basic rights to assemble are. So we're going to talk a little bit more now about what isn't covered by the First Amendment, because there are some pretty important distinctions between what is and is not covered, and there's a lot of common misconceptions, particularly coming up today with issues of social media and private companies and the right to free speech. So for starters, threats of imminent harm and violence aren't covered. Amendment does not restrict private individuals, non-state actors, people not acting in an official capacity as a government official, and it doesn't apply to private property owners. The right to assemble specifically says the right to peaceably assemble. That's a really important distinction. It's peaceable assembly. There's not a protected right to assemble in a way that's threatening or violent. Threats that would incite imminent lawless conduct, threats against a person, threats of violence or shows of force, that's not permissible and that's not protected. Most protests are peaceful and they don't pose harm to anyone or around the demonstration. It's really important to keep an eye out for possible issues because it really only takes one bad actor or an incident that the police misinterpret as threatening for things to start to get out of hand. Really trust your instincts on this. So if the mood starts to change, if things start to seem to escalate, if there's more police involvement than you would expect, you might want to remove yourself from the situation. There's really no hard and fast rules, but listen to your gut. Don't keep yourself in a situation that seems like it could get out of hand. If the situation does escalate and the police start to get involved, you could be arrested even if you're not doing anything illegal. There's been a history of police involvement in demonstrations that haven't been dangerous and police actions that escalate the situation from peaceful to dangerous. Sometimes the police will detain people and say that it's for crowd control to protect public safety. I'm not going to make a comment either way on whether that's right or not. It probably is very fact specific, but just be aware that if the tone starts to shift and the police get involved, you might want to try to get out of the area to protect yourself and to stay out of any negative interactions with the cops. One thing to be mindful of is where you are in relation to private property. Non-state actors, so private individuals and people not acting in their capacity as a government official, aren't constrained by the First Amendment. For example, a private property owner has the right to tell you to leave their property. You don't have a right to protest on private property without the property owner's consent. Private property owners can also set rules for what kind of expression is allowed on their property. So if Mr. Johnson had gone to his neighbor's house and burned the American flag on his neighbor's lawn, and his neighbor said, "Get out of here, I don't agree with that, I don't want you here," that would be perfectly fine. The First Amendment protects you from government interference in speech and assembly. Remember, Congress shall make no law. The First Amendment constrains what the government can do to restrict your expression and your right to assemble, not what private individuals are allowed to do on their own property. However, there's still limits to what a private property owner can do to exclude you from their property. It's not permissible to threaten protesters who aren't threatening you or entering your property, particularly if you involve deadly weapons and leave your property armed to try and make protesters in the street leave. In the summer of 2020, Mark and Patricia McCloskey made headlines when they pointed guns at protesters outside their home in St. Louis. They claimed the protesters were armed and threatening to harm them, but this has been disputed. The case garnered a lot of attention and debate over protesters' rights and the rights of private property owners. The McCloskeys eventually pled guilty to misdemeanors and were later pardoned by the governor of Missouri. I don't bring up this case to make any statement on whether what they did is right or wrong, but instead to provide an example of when private property owners go too far by the law in excluding protesters from their property. Another current example of something outside the scope of the First Amendment is the issue of free speech in social media. Companies like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube are allowed to suspend or ban users because they're private companies. Social media companies have the right to set terms of service, and if a user posts something that violates those terms, they can be excluded from the platform. You don't have the right to force a private entity to allow you to express yourself. Congress shall make no law, not corporations shall make no law. After January 6th, Senator Josh Hawley claimed that the publisher Simon & Schuster had violated his First Amendment rights by canceling his contract for book deal. Senator Hawley is incorrect. Private companies are not restricted by the First Amendment, and they have zero obligation to pay for and publish the work of someone they no longer wish to work with. Okay, now that we've talked about what's in the scope and what's outside of the scope of the First Amendment, let's kind of move back to talking about the right of assembly. So, police can't violate your right to assemble, but they can do a few things to maintain order and public safety. We've mentioned this briefly before. They can ask you to move to prevent or ease the obstruction of traffic. Other times, police might get more involved than just asking you to move from the sidewalk or the street. And even at a peaceful protest, there is a risk of being arrested because police officers are given a pretty wide latitude when it comes to maintaining order and safety. And that typically tends to be very fact-specific and subjective to each officer involved. Unfortunately, you could be arrested despite not having committed any crimes. There's been instances of police actions, including tear gas and rubber bullets that were deployed when that kind of offensive action was most likely not justified. It's a sad truth that police actions aren't always justified and they're not always proportional. With this in mind, it's really important to know your rights if you're detained or arrested by the police. If the police stop you, you don't need to talk to them. Ask them if you're free to leave. If they say yes, walk away. If they say no, you're being detained. The police are not allowed to arrest you unless they have reasonable suspicion that you're committing a crime. However, reasonable suspicion has been interpreted quite loosely. Ask the officer why you're being detained. Ask them what crime they suspect you of committing. Know that an officer can perform what's called a Terry frisk, which means they can pat you down to identify any weapons and make sure you don't pose a threat to them. But aside from a Terry frisk, they do not have the right to search you or seize any items from you without a warrant. Also keep in mind that these search and seizure rules, which come from the Fourth Amendment in the Bill of Rights, they also apply to digital devices. The police can't search your phone, they can't confiscate it, they can't delete anything off of it. You're allowed to record protests, you're allowed to record police interactions, and your phone has the same protections as other items of personal property. One note, if the police ask to search you or they ask to search your phone, if you consent to that, they're allowed to do it. If you don't want to be searched, say no. If you are arrested, don't talk to the police. Affirmatively invoke your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and ask for an attorney. Most protests don't end with arrest, but in the event that you are arrested, remain silent and seek an attorney. During an interaction with a police officer, try and stay calm and don't resist. But in saying that, I would also be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that staying calm and not resisting doesn't always protect you from police overreach and police brutality. Stay calm and don't resist, but if the police officer responds with force, they've stepped outside the bounds of legal police behavior. If you're a victim of unlawful police behavior, collect as much information about the officer and the incident that you can. You're entitled to file a complaint against the police officer and can even seek legal action. Due to current rules around qualified immunity, which is a form of immunity that protects police officers from lawsuits for misconduct, you might not be able to get legal relief, but it's important nonetheless to look at your options for recourse. Reminder, this does not constitute legal advice. If you have any questions, please contact a licensed attorney. If you're a victim of police brutality and you're looking for legal recourse, please contact an attorney. Please do not take anything from this presentation as legal advice. This is merely for informational purposes. I'd really like to shout out the ACLU's website again. If you're planning on attending a protest, it's a good resource to review, and a lot of this information is distilled from their resources, and they do a really great job of breaking things down piece by piece. All right, this concludes our brief lesson on the First Amendment and your right to speech and assembly. I hope it was informative and that you learned some more about the important protections entitled to you by the First Amendment. Before we say goodbye, final disclaimer and reminder, just so that you guys remember, this presentation is not legal advice. I'm not an attorney. If you need legal advice or assistance, please seek the assistance of a licensed attorney. Jurisdictions vary and different states may have different laws. While your First Amendment rights must be protected by the states, there may be some small differences in technicalities and laws around public demonstrations. Additionally, as I've unfortunately said before, following guidelines for peaceful protesting doesn't guarantee you won't be arrested or have a negative or abusive interaction with a police officer. If you believe your rights have been violated, please seek the assistance of a licensed attorney. Thanks for taking this time to explore the First Amendment with me. I hope you learned something. Bye for now.